Welcome back. We are joined today by Stanislav Krapivnik, a former U.S. Army officer now in Russia. Thank you for coming back on the program.
Zed. Always a pleasure. At the very beginning of all this insanity, when everybody started, so, oh, you can't wear anything with the letter Z. And then came Army Group V. And then the Russian military really started trolling. There was a whole convoy of cars or trucks, and they had every letter of the Latin alphabet written on there. Go ahead, ban them all.
After a while, the entire alphabet would disappear. Well, one of the main things I want to ask you about is what we're seeing on the front lines now, because this seems to be quite dramatic. That is the large city of Konstantinovka is now, well, not sure if it's fallen yet, but it's over 90% fallen at least. So, and this, of course, leaves only Slavyansk and Kramatorsk left. And after this,
well, there's Druzhenka.
in between, yeah. But essentially, this whole conglomerate opens up, and that would finish off Donbass, which is quite significant. But at the same time, we see Russia moving closer to Sumy, another important city, and of course, taking more territory, closing in from, well, for at least from the eastern direction towards Kharkov, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. So there seems to be huge changes now on the front lines. In Zaporizhia, though, there's, of course, the Russians are coming in from the east, but along the Dnieper, the Ukrainians have had some success. What is it that's happening now? I mean, across the front line?
Well, about a week and a half ago, the Ukrainians said, we may have to evacuate Mirograd, Dmitrov. We may have to pull out of there. Yeah, that fact that Mirograd was surrounded and fell 6 months ago, but hey, news travels slow to Kiev. And that the European Union that all think that Kiev is turned this conflict around and is marching on toward Moscow or some other ludicrous crap like that. They just don't admit to what they're losing, and they don't update their maps as long as they possibly can. But the reality is, you're right. Konstantinovka is basically gone. There's still a pocket of Ukrainian soldiers surrounding the southeast Konstantinovka that are being finished off. There's maybe about 10%, maybe less, because there is delays. The Russian Ministry of Defense doesn't publish instantly. They usually wait till they've cleaned up the area before they publish it that they've taken the area, which means sweeping every single building, every single room, every single basement to make sure there's no Ukrainian soldiers left over. And there's usually a couple here, a couple there left over, and they try to sneak out or they try to change clothes into civilian clothes. But having too many Nazi tattoos on you, like one too many, that kind of tends to give it away too. But luckily, they're all usually cooks and finance guys and truck drivers that never fired a rifle in their lives. It's amazing. Just about every Ukrainian POW is a truck driver or a cook. It's a whole army of truck drivers and cooks. I don't know who's fighting. I guess the dead guys are the ones that are fighting. It is pretty pathetic. I mean, when he says, just admit you're a soldier. So that's Konstantinovka. And there's another key element here. Dobropolye DNR. The Russian offensive in that direction is also branched off into the north, which brings it, because you've got Konstantinovka here, you got Druzhenka here, then you've got Kramatorsk, and you got Slavinsk. Well, this is coming up right here. It's coming up behind. It's still to the south of, but it's heading toward behind Druzhenka. So basically, you'd have that town surrounded from three sides, because the Russian front to Kramatorsk is also closing in. The front lines are about 5-6 kilometers out from the edge of Kramatorsk and Slavinsk. Slavinsk, where it all began. The actual fighting began. So that's there. And then on top, Krasny Liman is pretty much about 60% taken. Russian forces cut off the Ukrainians from supply about a month ago, fully cut them off, and now it's just raid, raid, push. They're not really trying to invest too heavily. They're just wearing them down because they know they're not getting resupplied. So no point in risking too many of your own troops. That's that entire area. Once Krasny Liman falls, all of Slavinsk is now under artillery and drone control because it's in the low ground below Krasny Liman, and it's an easy view of those territories. In fact, in 1944, the counteroffensive took those areas actually from the same direction. Because you take the high ground and then you go south into the low ground. It's much easier to roll your enemy up that way. Plus, you've got longer range for your artillery because you're on the high ground. High ground's still important. Sumy, Russian troops are probably about 6, maybe 7 kilometers out from the edge of the city, working their way through the forested areas to the northeast of the city. A lot of, even in the winter, the forests, of course, provide some amount of cover from drones because drones and branches, they just don't, they're not friends. But during the winter or the late fall, early spring, branches don't hide you from view. So once the Ukrainians know where you're moving, they have limited artillery. They can still use that limited artillery. The forests are green, so it's even harder for drones because leaves and drones also don't get along too well. And now you've also got the coverage from above. The Ukrainians can't see where the Russian forces are moving. So it's much easier to move larger bodies of troops instead of very small teams and to control logistics. Kharkov is still pretty far away. Kharkov is mostly an artillery duel at this point, artillery rocket duel, drone duel. But it's still pretty far away for Russian forces. They're still about 15, 16 kilometers out. They're moving, but they're not moving as fast as they're moving in other areas. And then when we swing further down in Zaporozhye, so Ukraine launched 3 counteroffensives in Zaporozhye since February. The last one was in the western portion of central Zaporozhye. The Ukrainians, they tend to have much more success in their counteroffensives for grabbing land, but they can't hold the land. And that's because they have success in grabbing land. And they have success because they don't give a damn about how many casualties they take, quite literally. They'll take massive amounts of casualties. So they'll be able to grab a big chunk of area, get the photo ops, but then they can't hold it. Because once they invested that area, they've lost so many troops and so much equipment, they can't hold it. And when the Russian forces reorganize and start rolling them back up, as it's happened every single time. So they're constantly launching these counteroffensives because the Russian offensive right now on Orykhov is coming from really 4 different directions. So Malotopmachka, which is a suburb town, village southeast of Orykhov. Orykhov runs on N08. It's a long, thin town, and it's got villages around it that they use as part of defensive belt. So Russian forces are in Malotopmachka fighting northwards. Russian forces from the west are about 6 kilometers out, and Russian forces from Gulyai-Polye, they took Gulyai-Polsky. I know these names repeat are pretty close, which places them 5 kilometers from northeastern portion of Orykhov, and there's another offensive heading even further north and deep encirclement. And basically, the N08 is tactically cut off because of drones and artillery. That town, that last fortified town in central Zaporozhye of any kind of size, is encircled. It's in a tactical encirclement. It's pretty hard to get anything in and out. While there's not a full physical encirclement, artillery and drones make life pretty much impossible to resupply in that town. So that's the zone right there. Once that falls, there's small villages all the way up to Zaporozhye city. That's why the Ukrainians are very desperately throwing everything they have into various counteroffensives in that area. They've they've all been stopped. There's some other localized counteroffensives. It's very hard to tell with the Ukrainian side too, because when they were being pushed out last year out of a lot of those areas, they took a lot of videos of themselves with flags and different points in time. So when they can, they start popping up those videos after the fact, and it's very hard to figure out, are they fresh videos or are they videos from a year ago? So that's, as part of their PR war. But that's the situation right now. Oh, after yesterday's strike on the Belarusian school bus, we may be seeing an expansion of this war. We'll have to see what Lukashenko says and does.
Yeah. Well, the war has changed dramatically, of course, over the past 4 years. That if you go back to 2022, when they had it was pretty much tanks, artilleries, armored vehicle mostly. It changed, to a large extent due to the introduction of drones. Well, primarily because of the drones, but
Right.
but this is also developing. We saw, then the jamming of the drones emerged, and they had, then they had the fiber optic cables for the drones, so they couldn't be jammed. And then, of course, now we hear some stories about Russia being able to also block the drones guided by Starlink. How is this already in place, or is this something developing? Because so far the reports I've seen haven't, well, seemingly been verified yet.
Yeah, what the Ukrainians have started doing is putting Starlinks on their drones, and that helps them guide them into deeper into Russia. And again, mostly they're hitting civilian targets. For example, there was a raid by Ukrainian drones yesterday, or this evening, or this at night, this morning, early morning, on Zelenograd, which is a island of Moscow to the northwest of Moscow. And again, there was hits on a refinery area, but again, the hits are almost always on fuel storage or product storage. So these vessels are allowed to burn out, and then they're replaced. They make the big fire. Like I've said many times, if you hit a refinery, you don't get a fire. You get a very small fire. The computer switches closes the valves, and nothing else gets pumped down the pipes. And then you replace the pipes and maybe some of the damaged vessels, if there's any damaged vessels. You hit the storage facilities; they burn brightly. They make a lot of smoke, and you get lots of big pictures in the West. Look, we're winning. Well, they're not winning. And those are relatively easy to replace because they're old technology. There's nothing big about them. It's just a metal. It's a metal circular containment structure with internal tank that that fills up with fuel or with raw oil, depending on what you're doing with it. But they did hit residential buildings, and this is a big difference right now that the Ukrainians have turned. The Ukrainians via the Americans and I'm going to blame the Americans absolutely for this, because the U.S. government is absolutely involved 100% in military funding, in satellite imagery, and so on, and Starlink, and absolutely in Starlink. So Americans are neck deep in civilian bloodshed. I know it's a surprise for everyone. God, that's shocking. I'm being sarcastic. For anybody who didn't figure that out, I'm being very sarcastic. And the Europeans, for that matter, the non-Russian Europeans, non-Belarusian Europeans, the number one targets have now become an absolute terrorist war from the side of the Ukrainians. They're hitting, because they're losing on the battlefield, they're hitting civilian targets almost exclusively. Residential buildings, they're flying the drones. This isn't a matter of drones been hit and it falls. This isn't a matter of Russian anti-aircraft missiles going down. The anti-aircraft systems in Russia, there are Panzer units that are placed on top of key government buildings in the cities, but those fire very small munitions, light missiles, and mostly chain guns. They're not going to destroy a building if they miss. The heavier systems are all placed outside the cities. We don't use our people as human shields for PR purposes the way the Ukrainians do when they put anti-aircraft systems right beside a school or a hospital, knowing that when it's hit, it's going to have collateral damage everywhere, and then it goes screaming, "Oh, look!" Or when they hit a Russian missile or drone overhead, it's going to fall down on some building, and they can still get PR out of this, or their own missiles fall on it. But the Ukrainian drones, you can see the videos, they're flying directly into apartment buildings and sometimes into private single resident homes. We've also seen a very large upspike of Ukrainians hitting buses, hitting civilian trains, hitting civilian trucks. And when they can't find those, they're going after just civilians on. I mean, there's a lot of, again, there's CCTV cameras everywhere. So you get to see the criminal activity of the West, the terrorist regime that the West is. Which, by the way, if the people in the West haven't figured out, whenever you finally wake up and decide you don't want to be a slave and a serf, that will be used against you as well. Because whatever the empire uses outside of it, it will always eventually use inside against its own people. Once it perfects it against whatever enemy it's fighting. Just food for thought. You don't like your government, you may get a drone through the window one day. Welcome to reality. This is what your governments will happily do this to you if they're doing it to somebody else right now. And they all are. And they damn well know what the Ukrainians are doing. They're arming them to the teeth to do it. And they're quite happy that they're murdering women and children. You're never going to hear any kind of criticism from anybody in the West about this. You're not. Because they're all Epstein elites. They'll eat your children, for God's sake. So sure, they'll drone you in your home if they don't like you. It's the hard, honest truth, but that's what it is. Yesterday the Ukrainians made this more of an international war. They droned a Belarusian school bus that was taking a team of footballers, kids, to a resort in southeastern Russia. They just got out of Belarus into Bryansk Oblast, which is the next one over. The Ukrainian drone flew into the bus, killed the wife of the coach, injured 2 other adults and 4 children. There were 44 people on this bus. Last week, they hit 2 buses. One, thankfully, nobody was injured. Another one, they burnt 8 people to death and 11 more were injured on a passenger bus. They hit a train. Today, there was videos came out from Bryansk where a Ukrainian drone flies through traffic in Belgrade and hits and kills a truck driver who's just stopping at a stoplight, and so on. This is everyday Western terrorism in Russia. Every single day.
I feel like the message coming out of the EU is also, and Germany especially, is leaning more and more towards this collective punishment. I mean, they're not openly, stating that civilian targets are okay, but in other spheres, for example, arguing that no Russian athlete or artist should be allowed into the EU because of Ukraine. So the whole idea of no collective punishment, it does appear to be over, which kind of changes the whole mentality. But I did want to ask you about well, not the end of the Iran war, that might be a bit naive, but at least a memorandum of understanding being reached in which the US is seemingly scaling down its forward positions. How do you think at least scaling down of the war in Iran will affect the war in Ukraine? Because you could have 2 competing views here. One would be that the US kind of ignored all diplomacy in Ukraine because Iran took all their focus. The other view would be that Iran was consuming their resources. I mean, the assumption is, it's based on what the basic assumption would be. That is the United States trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine or continue to push it? Because when I see Trump with the G7, they're still talking sanctions. They're still talking about sending more weapons, assisting in, of course, the local manufacturing there of weapons. So Again, it all depends what the US objectives are in Ukraine. If Trump wants to put an end to this war, the end of the war in Iran could be a good sign. If he doesn't want to, this essentially gives the US more space to, create more havoc in that part of the world. But at the same time, we hear now about the US drawing down its troops quite significantly in Europe. So, how are you reading all of this? I mean, are they putting an end to the war or outsourcing it to the Europeans?
Look, the U.S. Drive for hegemony hasn't ended. It has not gone away. Look, the British Empire is what's left of it is such a pathetic state that the Brits, the only reason the Brits have the Falklands is because Miley is in the pocket of the Americans and the Israelis, and he won't go take it. At this point, any Argentinian effort could drop any Argentinian boats that can get out to the Maldives or Falklands, which isn't a very long drive or sail from Argentina, would just take them because there's nothing that the British can do. But yet the British mentality is we're an empire. It hasn't gone away. They're still trying to act like an empire. They're a chihuahua with fleas infested and with lots of sores on its body that's rotting away as we look at it. But that chihuahua is still thinking that it's a Great Dane and trying to strut around like a Great Dane. And that's the British Empire, which we know is a joke, except for a few islands here and there. What do you say about the Americans? The Americans still are an empire. They're an empire in steep decline. They've shown the whole world that they can't take on a regional power. It's going to get smacked. They got smacked and they got their teeth handed to them. I mean, let's be realistic about it. The U.S. Navy has proven to be absolutely inept and inadequate to fight anybody except the smallest nations that they can bomb from the sea. They spent the entire war. The U.S. Navy spent this entire conflict, except for the quote blockade of the blockade, which they had about 6 destroyers and frigates enforcing that. So lots of ships got through anyways. And the only reason they were able to do this because they had a quote ceasefire and Iran wasn't actively trying to sink them. The rest of the time, the U.S. Navy spent running circles in the middle of the Indian Ocean to keep from becoming future reefs. And there's question about whether or not they were damaged anyways. Meanwhile, you had a mutiny, called a soft mutiny on the Ford. Those 80% of the toilets don't clog themselves just because everybody had a bad dinner. They clog themselves because they're shoving whatever they can down and flushing it like ropes and T-shirts to clog everything up because they want to go home. They're tired of this. U.S. military is in a very bad position. But I had a great talk with Larry Johnson, as a friend of mine. We do a show every week, and Larry was in a conference with a bunch of retired and still some active duty generals, and they want a war with Russia. They're convinced ground war with Russia we can win. This is the level, and quite a few of them are convinced they won in Iran. This is the level of psychosis that you're dealing with in the American elites, including these generals. So, by the way, the best does not rise because and it's not just Trump has now started picking generals for their political religious views. Generals have been getting in America picked for their political views for at least the last 30 years, if not longer. Not because of their talent, but because of their political views. Up to 1 star, you can still get up to 1 star on the talent. But after that, it's all strict politics. 2 stars and up, it's all politicians. So this is the people you're dealing with. You're not dealing with exactly the smartest people in the world. You're dealing with the people that can do fellatio on their masters better than anybody else. And that's the people you're dealing with. And yeah, Larry was just he's just shocked. Listen to people who think they won the Iran war. 13 American bases have been destroyed. The U.S. is again the capitulated in the memorandum. Whether or not this becomes reality going further, well, we'll live and see. Of course, right. To say that this war conflict is over is a long shot. Then there's the Israelis. They are not planning on stopping murder and mass murder. Why should they? They're on a roll. Until Israel gets enough casualties that they can't swallow it anymore, until every family is whining and screaming, they're not going to stop as a society. The problem here is as psychopathic and opportunistic and bloodthirsty as Netanyahu is, his opposition that will probably come to power soon enough is even worse. So you're dealing with one group of it's like you're dealing basically. Do you want the brown shirts or the black shirts in power in Berlin? This is what you're dealing with. Is it going to be the stormtroopers or is it going to be the SS? That's the elections, next elections in Israel if they happen. And the Israelis are in a position to keep this war going because they're still attacking Lebanon. Trump has been able to talk the Iranians down from launching heavy onto the Israelis, but that's only a matter of time. Because then Iran has to choose whether it loses face and becomes just another power like Turkey that talks a lot and doesn't do anything when the Israelis do it, or it has to back up its words with actions. And I think Iran will back up its words with actions, unlike Turkey. Turkey that doesn't even mind that Ukraine has sunk one of its cutters, military cutters. Never mind, Ukraine is attacking ships coming in and out of the Bosphorus Straits in Turkey waters. It even hit a Turkish tanker. And Erdogan, Erdogan has put a piece of his spine on every single seat he can find because his butt can't spread that far. So he's basically shown himself to be another barking chihuahua that won't do anything once any pressure gets on him. So, these are some of the leaders you're doing, but I don't think Iran is going to go down that road. They have no reason to go down the road. So, yeah, so right now, as far as resources, I mean, the U.S. is very depleted. Look, without Chinese magnets, I mean, some magnets are getting through. There'll be some amount of contraband. And from where my sources have been telling me, you don't want to know how many computer monitors and television sets the Americans are now scrambling to take apart to get the magnets out of those. Yeah, the van der Leyen and the Russians are taking chips out of washing machines. No, but the Americans are taking magnets out of television sets. With the digital television sets, that's where we're at right now, ladies and gentlemen. That's the insanity of things. So yeah, they're very depleted. Look, their maximum manufacturing rate is maybe 60 to 70 Patriot missiles a month. A month. Yeah, in a night flight of 500 drones and missiles, how much are you going to do? 30 targets, maybe 40 targets?
That would be an interesting development if it would be the US ending up at the end of the day to dismantle washing machines for its equipment. But
well, television sets, and monitors. Those have magnets.
Yeah. Well, let me ask last question though about how do you see how do you explain the large not just the offensive now taking place on the Russian side, but also the more hardline position that is we're seeing Kiev now being hit in ways it didn't before. And overall, in the Russian leadership as well, there seems to be a change in mood. That is, Putin in 2025 seemed to be all about diplomacy, all about anchorage, all about finding a common ground with Trump. Putin in 2026, he doesn't talk that much about diplomacy anymore. And now we're seeing all these, attacks, even again on Kiev as well, which was largely spared in the past. Do you see, both looking at the front line and the targeting of missiles, drones, do you see a change in the Russian posture here?
Yes, it's not nearly the change that the more hardline faction wants. Look, and I'm more of a hardliner, obviously enough, and I'll tell you this: the way things are going, and I said this 2 years ago, that if we don't respond hard enough, we're going to have to make an example, or we're going to have a nuclear war. And why I mean an example is sooner or later we're going to get to the point where you drop leaflets over Lvov, you tell everybody you have 24 hours to get out, and then you drop a nuclear missile onto that city. Ladies and gentlemen in the West, this is nuclear war. Tomorrow it's going to be your cities. Back the fuck off. That may be the only thing left, short of direct strikes onto the EU, that may wake up these idiots. And I don't know if that'll even be enough now. They're so done. They've gone so far down the rabbit hole in insanity that look, you got General Newman. We're ready to strike into Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg and the Kola Peninsula and into Crimea and maybe the Urals, and hell, we'll fly to Kamchatka because we're the Luftwaffe with our 500 aircraft of all types and sizes. Questionable how many of them can even fly. And do you hear anything from there? It's going, oh, this is just a general talking. This is not our official policy. No, that's the official policy of Germany. Then you get, oh, the Netherlands are building concentration camps for Russian POWs. Apparently, they've already built a bunch. And things like that. And yes, by the way, everybody in Russia hears this. The beat for war is now in Russia also. Russia is preparing for full conventional and nuclear war with Europe, which will be the death ride of Europe. Good chunk of the European Union won't fight, or NATO. We know that. The Greeks, the Bulgarians, they'll have a revolution before they fight. The Slovaks won't fight. Questionable about the Romanians. There's people waking up in Poland, but maybe not fast enough. But the Germans, the French, the British, the Norwegian countries, the Baltics, they're all hell bent on their own destruction. They're going to wind up getting destroyed, but they're hell bent on it. Their governments are gone well over the line of insanity, and the vast majority of the population backs them. I mean, that you don't see demonstrations, you don't see anything. Even counting that, there's lots of police state action all over Europe. And I mean, you see demonstrations breaking out in England, you see them breaking out in Ireland. You don't see them anymore in France. And the Germans, the West Germans have always had this little problem. They always follow whatever little Fuhrer they can find to the very end. And they've got another little Fuhrer standing there by the name of Merz. So the West Germans, as a majority, will follow him to their own death because that's just their mental state. The East Germans have been denazified. The West Germans were never denazified. They removed the Nazi symbols, but they kept the Nazis. And the West Germans were Nazis, and they still mostly are Nazis. Whether or not they do put a swastika up these days or not, but hey, but the Spiegel had an article. The Americans opened up their archives that they took out of the Gestapo at the end of the war, and they've opened up those archives. And Spiegel had a link and the story of, go see what your family was doing during Hitler's time. Maybe you're Nazis. It's cool to be a Nazi again. We're all Nazis. Yeah, this is cool. How long before the swastikas go back up officially in Berlin? It's the over-under. Start betting. But that's the reality of it. They've normalized it again. Don't feel guilty. Don't feel bad. And they never did. I mean, if you look at West Germany, how many? The first tier of the Nazi party were cut out. A lot of them wound up with a hangman's noose if they didn't put a bullet in their own head or took cyanide beforehand. But the second and third tier guys, they went right back into power and they got promotions. That was the reality of West Germany. Or they got to immigrate to America and become very honored citizens of America. So that was the reality for the second and third tier Nazis, Nazi scientists, Nazi officials, SS, Gestapo. Oh yeah, most of them didn't face any kind of actual punishment. Some of them got actual very good promotions at the end of the war. And definitely the industrialists. They came back out 7 years later and started forming the new European Order 2.0, otherwise known as European Union, otherwise known as the Association of Steel and Coal Producers. I think that's what it's called. Well, the bedrock of the EU. That was the bedrock of the EU. So that's the reality of it. So again, Putin's gotten much more hardline, but he's not nearly to where he's being pushed. And the continued terrorism by the West through their Ukrainian proxy is only pushing the hardline harder to strike the European Union and strike them hard. So, I mean, this is, I don't know if this train can be stopped at this point or turned around. Turning trains around is very difficult. But stopping them is still an option. But I don't think this train is going to be stopped anymore. As far as the Americans, sure, they're absolutely funding the Ukrainians. They're providing weapons. They are providing. Congress just sent another $9 billion. They're providing intelligence. Um, Nothing has really changed. Yeah, the price tag has mostly gone onto the Europeans, as opposed to the Americans. Americans are, quote, making money off of it. I'm not quite sure how much money they're making off it, but that's what the Americans are saying anyways. But yeah, they're fully into it. I mean, look at realistically. They're fully, absolutely into it. Nothing has changed. They got their teeth kicked in by the Iranians, which pushed them back because the Iran, it wasn't just a matter of taking over Iran. Iran's the gateway to Central Asia and the Caucasus. They'll make it much more easier to penetrate and try to attack Russia from the south, and then get China from the west. Iran stood its ground and it kicked the Americans in the teeth. So now they're having to back off, but they haven't stopped Project Ukraine. Nobody's canceled Project Ukraine. It's still on course. But the main goal of the Americans is not to fight. You're right, they are removing troops. They have lots of equipment. Watch when this war blows up, the Americans are going to go, we're neutral, but we'll sell you weapons. And that's the whole point. Massacre and murder off the European Union. If they're willing to die for the American cause as proxies, why not? They're slightly higher brand Ukrainians, and make money off of it. And then when the people pull themselves out of whatever rubble is left of Central Western Europe, the Americans will come in and go, we've got a new Marshall Plan for you. You'll be in debt for us for the next 200 years. We'll take your we'll take all your brains, we'll take your companies, and we'll rebuild your agrarian societies for you, Europe. That's the point of Europe. Europe is going to die. It's scheduled to die. It's willing to die. It can't wait to die. I guess as a society, some societies commit suicide. They say society is like an organism. Some organisms decide they don't longer want to live. And it seems like the European Union and its member states, at least some of them, have decided they no longer want to live. They want to go out in a blaze of glory. But then whatever's left of that is whatever's left of that. And Americans are more than happy to help the European Union die gloriously.
Yeah, I don't think. I wonder if they reflect over the messaging they're sending because, I mean, the Germans now talking so openly about exactly what they want to attack in Russia. I mean, yet again, they're setting dates for when they expect war with Russia. They, talking about mass producing all these long-range missiles to soften up the Russian targets before such a war. Allegedly these are Ukrainian attacks. And at the same time, as you said, when these stories, I mean, about the Dutch now building these camps for Russian prisoners of war, it begs the question what kind of war they think this will be. I think often the assumption is that, we'll send some troops into Ukraine. That's where we'll fight, and then the front lines there. We'll tip the scales a bit in the other direction. And I had a discussion recently with both Professor John Mearsheimer as well as Sergei Karaganov, and the latter having a key role in convincing Putin to change the nuclear doctrine. But I found it interesting because they both seem to agree on this point that it's near impossible now for Russia to not retaliate, and if they do, the Germans would likely hit back with conventional weapons, and at that point it's going to be such as the German threat now, and at this point it's going to be no control over the escalation ladder, and it would very rapidly escalate into a nuclear strike. Again, Mearsheimer, Karaganov also agree. Very unlikely the Americans would want to, sacrifice Washington, New York for Tallinn or Berlin. So it's a very dangerous path we're on, and I just don't understand what exactly the calculations are here. But more importantly, what kind of war? The Paris, Berlin, and London are expecting here, because the idea, as the Dutch are building this camps for Russian prisoners of war, do they do they expect to, march into Russia, capture Russians, take them back? I mean, this is not going to be.
Yep.
This is not going to be like the last 5 years. This is this will go into nuclear weapons so fast. It's just crazy to me that they have seemed to be planning for a very different war than what they're actually going to enter. I mean, this is almost a cliche that generals always plan for the previous war, but but that seems to be the case.
Well, it may not go nuclear, honestly speaking. It may not go nuclear. But even a conventional war, you talk to some of these Finns, a lot of these Finns, they're so brainwashed. Never mind, they've gone back or very quickly going back to being the armpit of Europe, as Finland always was, until they became part of the Russian Empire. And Russia built them Helsinki out of a stinking fishing village and everything else. I know that eats them up to know that. They were the whipping boy for the Swedes for hundreds of years. And under Russia, they actually got self-rule as an autonomous portion of the Russian Empire. The first time Finns actually ruled Finns, probably since somewhere in the Middle Ages. But you talk to these guys, I mean, you want to talk about brainwashed morons. They're all going to be super snipers, and the stupid Reds are going to run into our gardens, and we're going to just whack them left and right. We're going to be real heroes, la la la, just like video games. Like, no, gentlemen, what the war is going to be like is we're going to close the border. We're going to bomb all those bases, and then we're going to take out your key infrastructure, like, your electric power plants, your heating grids, your ports. And then winter comes. And there'll be a lot less Finns by the time spring comes on this earth. Probably half will freeze and die from hunger. And that's how the war is going to be fought. We're not going to come marching into your country. We're just going to wipe you out by destroying your infrastructure. And try living a, quote, civilized life in a 20-story apartment building when you have no electricity, no centralized heating, and it's minus 30 outside. And you got no food coming in. Finland doesn't grow food. Look where it's at. It's swamp, it's forest. They all love burgers. If you've ever been in Helsinki, there's a burger joint on every corner. They don't exactly have a lot of cows. And it's mostly milk cows. They're not exactly cow grazing territory. They, outside of fish, berries, and some limited agriculture, most of which, a lot of it's probably a hothouse that requires gas and electricity. They really don't have much for feeding themselves, a population that they now have. Finland was always a very thinly populated country for obvious reasons. Fishing and berries and other things like that and small gardening isn't going to feed a large population. They have a large population for that type of terrain in that area. They can't feed that population. If the ports are destroyed, if the electricity is gone, the heating is gone, the Finnish population is going to halve very, very quickly back to its natural levels of primitive living. And when you explain it to them, the steam goes out of them real hard, unless they're actually absolutely insanely brainwashed. Because as soon as they start thinking about reality, no, the Red Army is not coming marching into your garden so you can play Full Metal Jacket or whatever, not Full Metal Jacket, Call of Duty. That's like how war is going to be. It's just going to be long distance. We're just going to destroy everything until there's not many people left after winter. And if we want to take some, we'll go ahead and take it. Probably not. Maybe Helsinki, just to make sure the ports are open to St. Petersburg. But they don't understand the warfare. They're all living in video games and movies from World War II. But even Germany, I mean, look, underground gas storage facilities. Yeah, we got weapons that can take that out. Imagine the big boom that happens. No gas in Germany this winter. Yeah, that's an exact probability. When General Newman proudly stands up, there's a tall guy. He stands up pretty high and declares where they're going to strike with whatever limited aviation they actually have. He kind of forgets that there's going to be counterstrikes. And Russia has about 6-7 times more combat aircraft than Germany does. And Russia outguns Germany in everything. Germany is a second-rate power at best. a deindustrialized second-rate power. Germany is meat. America will provide the tanks for that meat to burn in and barbecue. That's what they want. That's what that's what the West Germans want. The East Germans sure as hell don't want that. So I think this will be the death ride of Germany. German unification has been the singular worst geopolitical mistake of the last 200 years, flat out. Well, 250 years. Germany has been unified for less than 100 years as a whole. We had that big break in the middle, and is marching to start a third world war. And as there's a Russian saying to that, the Germans owe us, not because of what they did to us in our country, but because of what we didn't do to them in their country. If in 1945 the Red Army had shot and gassed every single German to the last child, the world would have clapped. They would have been thrilled with that. There would have been no protests anywhere in most of Europe. They would have been extremely happy with that. And the Americans were discussing sterilizing the German men, making them into an agrarian society, and sterilizing all the German men. There was an active plan built for that. Just the Cold War broke out, and they decided they needed the Germans to be in fighting position. But quite literally, look up the archives. If we were like the West, there would be no Germans. There'd probably be no Poles. The French would be a lot fewer running around. The Silesians would have been probably gone too. We would have exterminated a very large chunk of Europe for everything Europe has done to us over the last 1,000 years. We're not Europeans. That's the way most of Europe is still alive. That's why the Germans are still alive. They should be thrilled that we are not Europeans. We don't think like Europeans do. We're Eastern Slavs. We own a half of Europe, but we're not Europeans. Because if we were, there wouldn't be Europe left right now for everything they've done. So if the Germans think there's going to be a Germany after this war, there will never be another Germany. It's the biggest geopolitical mistake ever. And by the way, it gave a reason for the French and the British to stop fighting each other. There's a fear of Germany, which has not been a good thing for everybody else since then either. But two world wars and they're marching through a third world war. You can't have a country like that.
People forget about
can't stop itself.
People forget about the Morgenthau plan. This was actually the plan, which I forgot how many, but how many Germans were expected to die from this. But quite horrific numbers.
Well, let's not forget the American POW camps for the Germans. It was the Western POW camps in general, but most of the American POW camps from 1945, because Eisenhower gave a command to his generals: no prisoners when the Allied armies crossed the Rhine. All Germans were to be exterminated. All German males, no prisoners, kill everybody. His generals ignored him, and Eisenhower's a German. But his generals ignored them. They took prisoners. There was nothing set up for these prisoners. Before that, the Americans were shipping German prisoners to the U.S. There were lots of POW camps that were in the U.S. But when 1944 turned in 1945, there was no POW camp set up. So they just set up POW camps in fields, open fields. And they were, a lot of people on the American camps were kept there through 1946 into 1947. And you got to figure most of these guys were kids, 16, 17, 15-year-old kids. This is the last drags of German society being thrown into the war, or old men. And read, most of these guys didn't say anything about it. There's been a couple books that have come out there. They're from American side too. Some of the generals that years later start going over, and historians start going over records, and they realized there was a genocide that the American military was conducting on the Germans. Over 1 million dead POWs, or people disappeared from records. And if you listen and you read to what some of these people at their old age are admitting, because I've got one in an American military magazine, Command Magazine. That's a military history magazine, and there's an interview with from the late 90s with a German POW. He's like, I was 16. I'm I'm an old man. I'm dying of cancer. I don't give a damn. I'm going to tell you the truth. Because he's like, all my life I was told that if you open your mouth about this, you're either a communist or you're a Nazi. But it's like he sat 2 years on a 16. He was taking POW. He pretty much this whole year just surrendered as soon as they saw the Americans. Like, just watching people die. Barely fed. They started in an open field. They're digging dugouts in the semi-frozen ground with their own hands. to survive the cold. He's just, most of his friends died from dysentery, from disease, and so on, from starvation. That was the American reality. The French had it better because the French Foreign Legion was there to sign up anybody who wanted to. Plus, the French were taking able-bodied kids off to work on the farms because they didn't have enough manpower, and they were getting fed on the farms. A lot of them wind up marrying the local girls and staying on those farms. Oh, the Netherlands, I mean, look what the Netherlands did in Belgium. They took those 14, 15-year-old kids as POWs, and before they let them go, they had to demine the fields with sticks. So you had, the 15-year-olds demining. A lot of them got blown up. That's Europe. That's how Europe plays games. While immorality teaches us how we're supposed to meet. If we were anything like most of Europe, there wouldn't be a German. There wouldn't be a lot of Europe left. Russian military didn't do that. In fact, the Germans that got marched off, the SS mostly got executed. They got tribunaled and executed. That was denazification. Most of the other Germans, my father, he was working in a factory since he was 14. So there were tons of, in Kharkov, there were tons of Germans working there. And when the Germans were allowed to go back, most of them didn't go back because these Germans were no longer living in POW camps. They had apartments, and most of them had wives and kids now. They'd married Russian women, and they just stayed because they had nothing to go back to. Even if you had a family in Germany, are they still alive? Did they even remember you? But meanwhile, you've got a wife and kids here. It's a rare guy that's going to drop what he has here and go and leave. Most of them stayed. So when they said, "Oh, they all died," no, they didn't die. Most of them became Russian Soviet citizens. They had wives and kids. There were plenty of women around. After the war, all things considered. So yeah, that was the reality. That's the difference. That is the difference between us and the EU and the people that populate the EU.
Well, we went already a bit over time here, so thank you for taking the time. And well, whenever I see these kind of things, these news stories, such as the Dutch or building this camp, or the Germans making these threats, or the Baltic states very evidently making their territory open for attacks. All of this makes its rounds around the Russian media as well. You can you can feel the you can feel the tensions, the anger growing. I mean, it's and at the same time, we see all these news stories about, look at this strike on Russia, look at this one on we're humiliating Putin. I mean, this is, the anger is boiling, and I don't understand if the goal is to thinking that the Russians will somehow capitulate, or if they fail to see that whatever attempts Putin has had to hold back this, boiling anger is becoming, it's not working anymore. So no, it's a very dangerous situation. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to having you on soon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Glenn. Hopefully not the worst. Let's end on a positive note. There is still chance to get off this train. The people need to wake the hell up.